Story 1. Let me tell you about something that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. It's one of those experiences where you feel like you barely made it out. This happened about a year ago when I was on a road trip. I was driving cross-country by myself through places I'd never been, and I guess I underestimated just how empty and isolated some of these stretches could be. I was passing through the Midwest, flat, open fields, miles of nothing. I'd been driving for hours, and the sun had long set. The GPS had me on this two-lane highway, no cars for miles in either direction. I hadn't seen a gas station, rest stop, or even a house for ages. I figured I'd push on for a bit longer before stopping for the night. Then my dashboard lights flickered for a second. Just a blink, but enough to make my stomach drop. Moments later, my car started sputtering. I glanced at the fuel gauge. It was fine, but something was wrong. The engine was choking, and before I could even process it, the car died completely. Dead in the middle of nowhere. No signal on my phone. No lights anywhere except for the stars and a thin slice of moon. I tried starting it again. Nothing. Not even a click. I sat there for a moment, the quiet pressing in on me. The darkness felt too thick. My pulse was racing, but I kept telling myself it was just a mechanical issue. Worst case scenario, I'd have to wait until morning for someone to drive by. As I sat there trying to calm myself, I noticed something, a figure, far down the road, just barely within the range of my headlights. Someone was walking toward me. At first, I couldn't believe it. Out here, in the middle of nowhere? I squinted to make sure I wasn't imagining things, but the closer they got, the clearer they became. A man, walking right down the center of the road toward my stalled car. My heart started racing. Why would anyone be out here this late? As he got closer, I could make out more details. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, a hood pulled over his head. My gut was screaming at me, telling me this wasn't right. I locked my doors, my hands shaking. He wasn't running, but his steps were deliberate, steady, like he knew exactly where he was going. He stopped just outside the reach of the headlights, standing there, staring directly at me. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of him, barely illuminated by the car's lights. I couldn't move, couldn't think, but every fiber of my being was telling me to run. But how? The car was dead, and I wasn't about to step out. For what felt like an eternity, he stood there, motionless. I thought maybe he was going to say something, ask for help, but he didn't. He just stared. Then, slowly, he started walking again, this time circling my car, moving into the shadows behind me, where I couldn't see him. That's when I heard it, the soft sound of metal, like something scraping against the back of the car. I whipped my head around, trying to see out of the rear window, but it was pitch black. He was out there, doing something. I frantically tried starting the car again, hands trembling on the key. Nothing. My breath was coming in short, panicked bursts. I felt trapped. Then, the sound stopped. Silence. The kind that makes your ears ring. I didn't know what was worse. The fact that he was out there or the fact that I couldn't see him anymore. My eyes darted to the side mirror, straining to catch a glimpse of any movement. And then, without warning, the passenger door handle jerked violently. My heart almost exploded in my chest. He was trying to get in. He yanked it again, harder this time, testing if it was locked. I threw myself across the seat, hitting the lock button repeatedly, though I knew it was already locked. The handle rattled, and I could hear his breath, shallow and heavy, just on the other side of the glass. I was trapped, and my mind was racing through every possible escape. Could I make a run for it? No. I wouldn't make it 5 feet in the dark. Could I call for help? No signal. Every option was cut off. The door handle rattled again, and I heard a soft, almost amused chuckle from outside. Then, in one horrifying moment, I saw him. He stepped back into the headlights, holding something shiny in his hand. A crowbar. My stomach twisted into a knot. He tapped it lightly against the hood of the car, like he was toying with me, deciding his next move. And that's when I saw it, the flicker of headlights coming from far down the road. Another car was coming. I don't think I've ever felt such a surge of hope and fear at the same time. The man saw it too. He froze for a second, then glanced back at me. For a moment, I thought he was going to try something, but instead, he bolted. He disappeared into the tall grass on the side of the road, melting into the night. The car pulled up behind mine, and an older couple got out, asking if I was okay. I don't even remember what I said to them. I was in shock, just mumbling something about my car breaking down. They offered to give me a lift to the next town, and I didn't hesitate to get in their car. I never saw the man again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was out there, watching, waiting. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if that couple hadn't shown up when they did. If I'd been just a few minutes later. Story 2. This one happened to me when I was backpacking through Brazil. I was on this 2-week jungle trek, something I'd always wanted to do. Get off the grid, see nature in its rawest form. I was traveling with a small group, just 4 of us and a guide, moving through dense rainforests with only the sound of the jungle to keep us company. It was remote, isolated, and the deeper we went, the more it felt like we were the only people for miles. One night, we camped near a river, miles from the nearest village. The day had been exhausting, the heat and humidity taking a toll. So by nightfall, everyone was wiped out. We set up our tents, ate a quick meal, and turned in for the night. The jungle at night is a different world, loud, alive, with every kind of insect and creature calling out. But I had gotten used to it over the last few days. Around midnight, I woke up. At first, I thought it was just the usual noises, frogs, insects, rustling leaves, but this time, something felt wrong. There was an odd quietness outside, like the jungle was holding its breath. My tent was small, so I could hear everything clearly, and what I heard next made my skin crawl. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, but not from any animal. Someone was walking around our camp. I strained to listen, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It wasn't the guide, and it definitely wasn't one of the others. They were all snoring softly in their tents. My heart started pounding. The footsteps circled our tents, moving closer, then stopping right outside mine. I held my breath, every instinct screaming at me to stay still. Whoever it was stood there for a moment, so close I could hear their breathing. It was slow, heavy, almost like they were savoring the moment. I didn't know if they knew I was awake, or if they were just waiting for something. My mind raced with questions. Could it be someone from a nearby village? A poacher? Or something worse? Then they moved. Slowly, they began walking again, but this time, I heard them stop at the next tent over, Mark's tent. Mark had been having trouble sleeping the past few nights, so when I heard his tent zipper slowly being pulled open, my stomach flipped. I wanted to shout, to warn him, but fear kept me frozen in place. There was a long pause, and then the sound of whispering, low, unintelligible. It was coming from inside Mark's tent. Whoever was out there was whispering to him, but it wasn't a language I recognized. Mark didn't say a word. He didn't make a sound. I don't know if he was too scared to respond, or if he was still asleep, oblivious to what was happening. But the whispering continued, quiet, insistent. After what felt like hours but must have only been minutes, the zipper closed again, and the footsteps retreated back into the jungle, swallowed by the thick foliage. I lay there, heart racing, drenched in sweat, waiting for something else to happen. But the jungle went back to its usual noises, like nothing had been wrong. At dawn, when the light finally filtered through the trees, I stepped out of my tent. The others were already up, acting like nothing was amiss. But Mark, he looked pale, shaken. I pulled him aside and asked him if he had heard anything during the night. He hesitated for a long time before answering, eyes darting around like he was still scared to speak it aloud. "I thought it was one of you," he whispered. "Someone came into my tent. They didn't touch me. Just stood there, whispered something, but I couldn't understand it. And then they left." We checked around camp. No tracks, no sign of anyone, but we all felt it, the lingering unease that someone or something had been there with us. The guide dismissed it, said we were letting the jungle get to our heads, but we all knew better. We packed up and moved on, trying to forget what had happened. But Mark, he couldn't shake it. 2 days later, he bailed on the trek, insisting he needed to go back to the village. He said he couldn't sleep, that he felt like someone was watching him, following him through the jungle. We laughed it off, but when I saw the fear in his eyes, I knew he wasn't making it up. I finished the trek with the others, but to this day, when I think back to that night, I still wonder who or what was out there, and why were they watching us? Story 3. A couple of years ago, I was traveling in the southern part of Brazil, near the Paraguay border. I'd rented a cabin deep in the forest, about a 20-minute drive from a small village. I wasn't looking for adventure, just a few days to myself, away from civilization, where the only noise came from the wind and the animals. The cabin was bare bones. No electricity, just a kerosene lamp and a wood stove. The nearest neighbor was a good 30-minute walk through thick trees, and the road leading to the cabin was barely more than a dirt track. By day, the place felt peaceful, but by night, it was a different story. When the sun went down, the forest swallowed everything, and the darkness felt like a living thing. On the second night, I sat on the porch, taking in the eerie silence. No birds, no insects, just the sound of wind moving through the trees like it was carrying something with it. I tried to shake the weird feeling creeping over me, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But as I sat there, I noticed something. Movement deep in the trees. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some animal, but then I realized it wasn't. The figure was tall, human-shaped, and it was moving slowly, deliberately, like it was stalking something. I froze, squinting into the trees, hoping I was imagining things. But no, the figure was real. Someone was out there, watching. I yelled, "Hey, who's there?" My voice echoed in the quiet, but the figure didn't respond. It stopped for a second, as if it was listening, then slowly started moving again. My pulse quickened. This was no hunter, no local. It was something else. Someone who didn't want to be seen. I stood up, backing toward the door of the cabin, but kept my eyes on the trees. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush, but faster now, moving toward me. My heart was racing, and I bolted inside the cabin, slamming the door and locking it. For a minute, everything was quiet. I told myself maybe it was just some weirdo passing through, and he was gone now. But then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The footsteps didn't stop. They were outside, circling the cabin. Heavy, deliberate, like whoever was wanting me to hear them. And then a knock. Slow, rhythmic. Someone was knocking on my front door. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find for defense, a rusty machete hanging on the wall, probably left behind by the last tenant. My hands were shaking, and my grip was slick with sweat, but I held on to it like it was the only thing keeping me alive. The knock came again, louder this time. "Go away," I shouted. No response. The knocking stopped, but now I could hear scratching, faint but deliberate, on the side of the cabin, like whoever was out there was running their nails along the wood, testing it. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't trying to come in through the door. They were trying to find another way in. I darted to the window and peeked through a gap in the curtains. That's when I saw him, standing just at the edge of the clearing, a tall man in ragged clothes, his face obscured by a tattered hood. He was holding something, a long knife, gleaming in the moonlight. He wasn't trying to break in yet. He was watching, waiting. And then, without warning, he lunged forward, sprinting toward the side of the cabin. I heard the wood creak as he slammed into it, trying to break through. My heart was in my throat, and I could barely think straight. I ran to the back door, trying to get out before he could force his way in, but the second I touched the handle, I heard footsteps there too. There were two of them. The back door rattled, and I knew I was trapped. I could hear the first guy now, hammering on the wall with the butt of his knife, trying to break through the thin wood. The cabin wasn't going to hold for long. I had to get out. I scanned the room, and my eyes landed on the narrow window above the sink. It was my only chance. I yanked the table over, climbed up, and smashed the window with a machete. Glass shattered, and I started squeezing through, cutting my arms on the jagged edges, but I didn't care. I could hear them closing in, their footsteps growing faster, more frantic. I hit the ground hard on the other side, and without looking back, I ran. My legs felt like they were on fire, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But I pushed through, sprinting toward the trees, the machete still clenched in my hand. Behind me, I could hear them, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. Branches whipped my face as I tore through the dense forest. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. I could hear their breathing now, heavy and animal-like, right on my heels. I wasn't going to make it. Then, I saw it, a faint light up ahead, flickering through the trees. A house, or a shack, or something. I didn't have time to think. I bolted for it, feeling the ground slipping away beneath my feet as I ran harder than I ever had in my life. I burst through the clearing and saw an old wooden hut, barely standing, but it was something. I threw myself against the door, pounding on it like my life depended on it. It swung open, and an old man stood there, his eyes wide with confusion. "Please," I gasped. "They're coming." He didn't ask questions. He grabbed me by the arm, yanked me inside, and slammed the door shut. I collapsed against the floor, panting, my whole body shaking. The footsteps outside slowed, circling the hut, like they were deciding whether to come closer. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't try to break in. And then, silence. The footsteps stopped. I waited, listening for anything, breathing, movement, but there was nothing. They were gone. I don't know who those men were or what they wanted, but they never found me. The old man let me stay until morning, and when the sun finally rose, I left that place as fast as I could. But to this day, the sound of footsteps in the dark still sends chills down my spine. If you enjoyed these stories, please like and subscribe. Also, check out my other true horror stories.